Welcome back. Now we're going to pick up with the section on payroll taxes and subsidies. Now that we've built an understanding of the labor market equilibrium, we can explore how the market will respond due to changes in different government policies. So we're going to start with how government policies like payroll taxes and employment subsidies can impact this balance of supply and demand. So for instance, payroll taxes, they're applied to wages and they affect both employers' cost and the take-home pay that workers receive. On the other hand, subsidies are designed to reduce costs for either employers or for workers, make it easier for them to get hired, make firms more likely to hire them. So now we'll look at how these interventions shift the supply and demand curves and change the wage level and the employment outcomes at the new equilibrium level. For example, the payroll taxes imposed, how does the employer bear the cost? Do they bear all of the costs, or is it shared with the workers? And how does an employment subsidy impact a firm's decision to hire? Does it make them more likely to hire someone or less likely? These are some of the questions that we'll answer as we delve into this topic in this lecture. It's tempting to think that the person who pays the tax or the party that pays the tax is the one whom the tax is levied on. But in reality, this isn't the case. We can compare the effect of taxes and subsidies levied on both sides of the market and compare the outcomes to see this. So let's start with a simple example. The government decides to levy a payroll tax. What would be the effect of instituting a tax? The demand curve would shift downwards. It would be like right now, the immediate effect is that it is relatively more expensive for a firm to hire a worker. It is as if their wages increase from the firm's perspective. Even though the worker isn't receiving any more, the firm is paying more. So if they were paying $10 an hour before the tax, and they face a $1 per hour tax, that's the same as a firm paying $11 an hour to the worker. So their demand curve for workers shifts downwards. The textbook mentions a wedge between the wage received by the employees and the amount paid by the firms, and this difference is the tax itself. Because they increase the cost of employment, these taxes end up reducing the overall employment level in the economy. When a payroll tax is introduced, it increases the cost of hiring workers. This means that employers might not be able to afford to hire as many workers as they did before, so employment can go down. On the other hand, workers may also feel the effect because part of the tax might come out of their wages, meaning that they take home less pay as a result. In the end, both employers and workers usually share the burden of the tax, and the overall effect is that fewer people are employed and wages are lower than they would have been without the tax. So let's turn to the model supply and demand to see exactly how this happens. Here we see visually what happens. When the government institutes a $1 payroll tax, initially, before that is implemented, the firm's demand curve is at D0 right here. After the tax increases the cost of employment, it shifts the demand curve down to D1, down here to this curve. Remember, each point along the demand curve represents the number of workers that firms are willing to hire at that particular wage. So if the market equilibrium wage is W0 right here, initially that means they're going to hire E0 workers. But once the tax is imposed, the cost to the firm of wages plus the taxes is going to increase from $10 to $11. So it increases how much the firm faces from employing each worker. Since at this employment level, firms are only willing to pay $10 to that many workers, they'll reduce wages by $1. So their total labor costs would remain at W0. This causes the demand curve to shift downward by $1. So we can trace the equilibrium point. Trace it from point A, the point that's on the parallel demand curve down here. That is simply shifted down from the original demand curve to now demand curve D1 by $1 lower. Now there's no change in the supply curve because nothing changes from the worker's perspective at first. As we move along the supply curve from point A down here to where it crosses the new demand curve at point B, that's our new equilibrium point. So the wage received by the worker is now lower. It's at W1, which lies between the previous wage of $10 per hour and the $9 per hour wage that the firms initially were willing to pay after the tax in order to keep their payroll the same. But while the worker receives wage W1, the firm pays wage W1 plus 1 on each worker. So it's as if they're still paying higher wages. Despite the fact that the tax is physically paid by firms, it affects the workers too. What we should notice here is that both firms and workers lose out because it's payroll tax. Workers receive lower wages and fewer than work. Firms also have higher labor costs and end up hiring fewer workers, or reduces their output. Now, often payroll taxes are for programs like Social Security and Medicare, so we're not talking about bad things. And these costs aren't being created for no good reason. There is, a program that provides benefits to people that these taxes are funding, and workers and society in general can benefit from these programs. But it's still important to recognize that they do cause labor market distortions and they create real costs. So let's see what happens if the tax is imposed on workers instead. In this case, the worker, instead of the firm, would be the one cutting the check to the government physically. Although the tax is technically being paid by a different party, the overall outcome is the same. The important thing to remember is that regardless of whether the tax is placed on firms or workers, the burden of the tax is shared between both. If the tax is imposed on workers, it will shift the supply curve up and to the left, or decreasing the supply. At this level of employment, workers will want wage W0. So now if they have to pay $1 out of their paycheck just to work, they'll have to receive W0 plus 1 in order to keep working. This creates a wedge between how much the workers are paid by the firm and how much they take home. The labor market equilibrium then shifts from point A to point B. The firm ends up paying a higher wage, W1. The workers receive W1 minus 1 because this time they're the one paying the tax. So we end up in the same place, no matter which side pays the tax. We've now seen how payroll taxes impact both firms and workers. In both cases, the total burden of the tax is shared between them, depending on how responsive each side is to changes in wages. Whether the tax is imposed on firms or workers, the main takeaway is that the cost gets split between the two parties. So the key here is that who pays the tax directly, who writes the check to the government, doesn't necessarily determine who bears the real burden. That's determined by how flexible supply and demand are. The true incidence of the payroll tax, or who bears the real cost of the payroll tax, is not determined by who physically pays it, but rather it's determined in the competitive labor market. Now, we've seen how payroll taxes are typically shared between firms and workers, but now let's look at an extreme case where workers pay the entire tax themselves. Now, what would it take for the workers to be the only ones to bear any of the costs of this? Perfectly inelastic labor supply curve is what it will take. A perfectly inelastic labor supply curve means that the quantity of labor that workers are willing to supply does not change no matter what the wage level. Workers will continue to supply the same amount of labor, even if wages increase or if they didn't decrease. So an example might be a highly specialized medical profession like surgeons. If a region only has a few surgeons and the number of surgeries needed is high, those surgeons will continue working the same hours or work extra hours, regardless of changes in pay. They're committed to the work because it's vital and there are so few people with the necessary skills. But obviously, the only time this will actually happen is if the skills are extremely rare and these market things are localized, and I doubt it will last for very long. They may be willing to keep this up in the short term despite a drop in wages, but they won't over the long term. So in these extreme situations, why do the workers face all the tax incidents? So in this case, regardless of the wage, E0 workers are employed. So right here, because the supply curve is a vertical line, it's always going to be E0 number of workers employed. As the demand curve shifts downwards, the wages paid will fall by $1, but the level of employment will not at all. So if this is so rare, why should we care about this? If it's only going to last for, a short period of time in very small, very localized, specialized labor markets. It's because this gives us an important idea. When the labor supply curve is inelastic, relatively inelastic, meaning that the labor supply curve is less responsive to a change in wages. So not a perfectly vertical line, but it has a pretty steep slope. In those situations, more of the incidence of the payroll tax will fall on the workers. The labor supply curves for men tend to be more inelastic. So a payroll tax on men is mostly borne by these workers. It's not borne by the firms paying them because they're going to keep working. On the other hand, the labor supply curves for teenagers and people over 65, they tend to be much more elastic. For them, relatively little of the tax is being paid by them because they will respond to the tax by leaving the market. So instead of facing lower wages, they primarily just have lower employment from these taxes. Because payroll taxes distort the labor market and create costs for both sides, both firms and workers, they're said to create a deadweight loss. A deadweight loss in the labor market occurs when the payroll taxes distort the equilibrium between supply and demand for labor. This inefficiency, because remember, equilibrium is the most efficient condition for the labor market. When we move out of equilibrium, this inefficiency results in fewer workers being hired and fewer jobs available to them than in the tax-free market before it's implemented. Essentially, what happens is the tax creates a gap between what employers pay and what workers receive, leading to a loss of economic efficiency because some mutually beneficial transactions between workers and employers do not occur. Remember, in a free market, all transactions are what we call mutually beneficial. Both the seller and the buyer is made better off by trading what they have for what they want. So when we, in this case, create a payroll tax, but we do anything to knock the economy out of equilibrium, to change the supply and demand conditions, both producer surplus and consumer surplus is reduced. So in this case, for the payroll tax, some of that producer and consumer surplus that no longer goes to the consumer and the producer goes to the government in the form of the tax. That's the difference between the wage being paid by the firm and the wage being received by the worker. But some of it is simply lost. Instead of going to the government, there are transactions that never take place now because of the reduction in employment. That doesn't go to anyone. That is completely lost. So here, the figure on the left shows the labor market before the payroll tax. It's Pareto efficient, with the consumer and producer surplus being maximized, the employment at E0. But once the payroll tax is implemented, what happens? The wage that workers receive fall from W0 to W net. The worker's surplus falls from the area of Q to the area of Q star. We don't need any geometric formula to tell us that this is a smaller area than Q was on the left side. The firm's surplus also falls from P to P star after the total cost of employing a worker increases to W total. The area T here, right there, is the revenue that the government receives from the tax. But remember, now there are fewer workers that are working compared to the initial equilibrium. We move from E0 down to E1. Those workers that we lose that are no longer being employed, that in the initial equilibrium, both the firm would want to hire and the workers would want to work, represent the deadweight loss. So this area here, this triangle that's in purple, labeled DL, is the deadweight loss from the transactions that would have occurred absent the tax. So this is not being captured by anyone. It's not going to the government. It's not going to firms. It's not going to workers. And this is why so many economists appear reflexively anti-government, and they appear skeptical of either taxes or other regulatory programs, as they tend to create this deadweight loss. And it's honestly difficult to notice these sorts of deadweight losses because they're things that don't occur. So now the benefits of this tax, for instance, the payroll tax funding Social Security, may be huge, but there is still this deadweight loss, this cost that exists. Many times the deadweight loss is greater than the supposed gain. And these are for much smaller, less important types of regulations that, don't go to millions and millions and millions of seniors like Social Security. So when economists talk about cost-benefit analyses, this is what part of the thing that we're talking about is there's this cost here that also has to be considered. So what this helps illustrate for us is how these interventions can prevent the market from reaching an optimal allocation of resources, leading to reduction in overall economic welfare. If we understand how deadweight loss helps policymakers assess the trade-offs of their decisions, it enables them to design interventions that minimize inefficiencies and better support both consumers and producers. So by recognizing and addressing the deadweight loss, we can design policies that enhance market efficiency, and improve overall economic outcomes. Certain types of taxes can discourage employment, but there are other ways for the government to encourage employment, so to do the opposite. One example of this is through employment subsidies. So employment subsidies have the exact opposite effect of a payroll tax. A payroll subsidy is a financial incentive provided by the government to employers, to firms, to encourage them to hire more workers or to maintain their current employment levels when they would typically want to lay off some of their workers. Essentially, how they work is reducing the cost of labor for businesses by offsetting part of the wages they need to pay. By lowering the cost of hiring workers, because a portion of the wages being paid by the government, they have the effect of increasing employment. So let's see this visually. Initially, the demand curve is at D0, and the equilibrium point is a point A. Once the government enacts this employment subsidy, it's going to increase demand for workers, or shift the demand curve to the right. We move from, in this case, demand curve D0 to D1, which is the previous demand curve D0 shifted up by that $1 per hour wage subsidy. The level of employment increases because the firm faces a lower cost to employment than the actual wage that the worker is receiving. So they'll be willing to hire workers with a lower marginal value of production because they're now facing a lower wage payment to the workers. Now, what do we see in the end? Workers are paid a higher wage, now with W1 instead of W0. But like the payroll tax, they do not capture all the benefits from the subsidy. Firms also benefit from paying a lower wage to the workers. Your textbook gives an example with actual elasticities, and they put together an equation to figure it out. The math isn't really important, but what I want you to recognize is that the firm will gain by paying lower wages than before the subsidy, and the worker will gain from receiving higher wages from before, just the same as what we saw with the payroll tax. We've talked about how payroll taxes and subsidies and how they both affect equilibrium using the model of supply and demand to understand how this happens. Now we're going to explore another type of government intervention, mandated benefits. Mandated benefits are perks or protections that employers are legally required to provide their employees beyond wages. These typically include things like health insurance, retirement contributions, paid leave like vacation, sick leave or parental leave, and workers' compensation. Governments require these benefits in part to ensure that workers have access to important protections and important services that might not be provided in a fully competitive labor market. The idea is that without these mandates, some workers might not receive the benefits essential for their well-being, things like health coverage, that can lead to broader societal issues. Now, the economist Thomas Sowell likes to say, there are no solutions, only trade-offs. Just like with taxes, these mandates impact the labor market by influencing both employers' hiring decisions and workers' willingness to work. While these mandates may be good or be for good things, they also distort the labor market in interesting ways, which are worth exploring. So let's dive into how these benefits affect the supply and demand for labor. We can use the model of supply and demand to understand how this happens and analyze how changes in costs or incentives impact both sides. For example, when a benefit like health insurance is mandated, it increases the total cost for firms to hire workers because they now have to provide this benefit in addition to wages. The supply and demand model lets us visualize how this cost might lead to a shift in the labor demand curve, potentially reducing the number of workers that firms are willing to hire at the same wage. On the supply side, workers might value the benefit, so they might be willing to accept slightly lower wages in exchange for its compensation. On human resources, you may have some decision-making over what benefit your firm offers above and beyond what is required. What is great about this sort of analysis is that you can apply these concepts to other types of benefits. So let's think of a specific example of a fake mandated benefit, like a requirement for each company to serve freshly brewed coffee for each worker. The figure on the left shows the market initially in equilibrium at employment level E0. Let's suppose that the cost of coffee for the week per employee is $C per worker. So what's going to happen? Well, the coffee is a cost of C, which is the same effect as the payroll tax in our earlier example. This is an added cost to the firm. So it is as if they're paying more for each worker. This will shift their demand curve down and to the left to D1 from D0. The difference between the demand curves are the cost of the coffee. So in this case, it's C. In this case, the wage that the firm pays will fall to W1, and the level of employment will fall to E1. Firms will want fewer workers because fewer are able to satisfy the wage equaling the marginal value of production condition at the new higher level of the wage plus the cost of the coffee. But if the workers like the coffee, they'll respond by increasing their willingness to work or shifting the supply curve to the right. So the figure on the left shows the case where the workers tend to value the coffee, but they don't value it as much as it costs the firms to buy it. So perhaps some of the employees like tea and some like brewing coffee at home. Maybe some don't like coffee at all. So in this case, the supply curve shifts to S1, which is less than how much the demand curve shifts. So it's not that full C. Maybe it's C minus 0.5, so it's half of it. Yeah, so in this case, the employment will increase from E1. So it's not because they're receiving this benefit, workers will still like it, but not get all the way back to the initial equilibrium employment level at E0. It will go part of the way to E star. So the policy results in lower employment and lower wages. Now the wages are at W star instead of W0 because there's this other benefit, the coffee that they're getting. Now, if we look at panel B on the right, this shows the same thing, but in this case, the workers value the mandated benefit equal to its cost. So the supply curve here is going to shift such that the employment level stays the same. It still lies at employment level E0. Now, the wage being paid to the worker actually going into their paycheck is lower at W star instead of W0. The cost of the firm for each worker is W star plus C, and the value received by the workers is W star plus C, which is equal to the old wage. So now they're getting less money in their paycheck, but they're getting the benefit of that, in this case, the coffee, which is equal to how much money they're losing. So it ends up being the same, basically. So the government can either tax and create a program, or they can require firms to provide something. The tools of supply and demand allow us to compare the effect of both ways of achieving the same goal to see which is more efficient. So what we've seen from this analysis is that as long as the workers actually value the mandated benefit in some way, it will cause less disruption to require the firms to provide this benefit rather than instituting a payroll tax and having the government provide it. And there's some cases where, or some instances where this will be the case, where it's possible for the government and firms to both provide something. In this case, instead of the government providing it and funding it through a payroll tax, it'll be more efficient for them to mandate the benefit from the firms. So the firms are actually providing it. When there's a payroll tax, we only see demand shifts. In the real world, we don't place a tax on workers. So it's going to be the demand curve here on the panel on the right. Both mandated benefits, as long as workers actually value that benefit, there will be an increase in supply to account for at least some of the change. So we'll not have the same distortionary effect. Now, before we move on to the next sections, we'll take a break here because we've talked quite a bit and went through a lot of different concepts in this lecture. The reason I wanted to stick them all together is because I wanted to freshen your mind for this comparison at the end. But next, we're going to dig in on the chapter or the section of the chapter on immigration.